In just 17 silent seconds, one father in the third row shattered a live TV debate without saying a single word. He didn't shout. He didn't point. He didn't even blink twice. But the moment he stood, the temperature in the room dropped, the laughter died, and Jasmine Crockett, one of the fiercest voices in Congress, suddenly stopped mid-sentence. A joke that once felt clever now hung heavy in the air, and for the first time in her career, she wasn't sure whether to speak again or stay still. This wasn't a political scandal. It wasn't a protest. There were no headlines, at least not at first. But for the people in that room and eventually for millions watching at home, something irreversible happened. Because sometimes the most powerful protest isn't a raised fist. It's a quiet man in the third row, refusing to laugh. What did Jasmine say that turned a moment of applause into a national mirror? Let's go back to the beginning. The room was full, the lights were hot, the cameras were rolling, and Jasmine Crockett was ready to dominate until something happened that no script could prepare her for. The lights inside Studio 6B didn't just shine, they pressed down. The air held a hum, constant and calculated, like it had been filtered not for comfort, but for control. And yet beneath the polished desk, where producers usually passed notes and makeup assistants tiptoed in with blotting powder, there was stillness. Not the good kind, the kind that comes just before a decision gets made that can't be undone. Jasmine Crockett sat tall under the glare, her shoulders squared, her deep green blazer tailored to perfection. She didn't just look composed, she looked unshakable. Her expression bore the kind of smile you learn not in law school, but in courtrooms. When the stakes are lives and the silence between words can twist a verdict, her hands resting lightly on the table, didn't twitch, didn't fidget. She had done this too many times. Another panel, another debate, another moment to cut through noise with clarity. Across from her sat Kash Patel, rigid in a high-collared black suit. He had barely moved since he arrived. No water, no blinking, just the occasional shift of his gaze. Never toward Jasmine, never toward the camera. Only downward to the exact corner of the table where his fingers traced a slow, soundless rhythm. The moderator, Michael Hayes, shuffled his notes with the practiced ease of a man who'd hosted 200 episodes and survived at least a dozen scandals, none of them his own. He offered the opening pleasantries, framed the debate as an honest conversation in divided times, and introduced the guest with just enough emphasis to signal importance without suggesting bias. But even he noticed it. The room wasn't breathing right. Not yet. There were no coughs from the audience, no murmurs, no rustling, just a sea of eyes. And somewhere in the third row, a presence that hadn't yet made itself known, but had already started shifting the current of the room. Jasmine scanned the crowd briefly. She always did this, not for performance, but to assess. She could spot a hostile glare at 30 feet and knew exactly when someone was recording with a phone tucked in a pocket. But this time, her glance slid past something or someone. A man in gray, upright, still, watching. But Jasmine didn't register it, yet. Instead, she leaned forward, locked eyes with Michael, and offered the first line of the evening with the confidence of a woman who had walked into fire before and never once been burned. "Let's not pretend this is new," she said, voice smooth as steel wrapped in silk. "Some people are just uncomfortable when truth shows up looking like me." The audience shifted, not outwardly, but inside. Something was being set, not just the tone of the discussion, the terms of the reckoning. It hadn't arrived yet, but it was near. And behind her, the man in the third row did not blink. It came at the 23-minute mark, sharp, unexpected, and delivered with the kind of effortless confidence that had made Jasmine Crockett a standout voice in every panel she'd ever sat on. The debate had reached a boiling point. Michael Hayes had just posed a question about racial representation in federal institutions, carefully phrased, designed to invite nuance. Instead, it lit a fuse. Jasmine leaned forward, lifted her chin slightly, and said it with a chuckle. "Let's be honest. Some people aren't chosen for what they've done. They're chosen for how they look on a brochure." She smiled, not cruelly, not even mockingly. It was the kind of smile people use when they think they've said something clever, something too sharp to be refuted, and too subtle to be called out. A lawyer's smile, a fighter's grin. The audience tittered. A few scattered laughs rippled through the room, mostly from the left side where her supporters sat. But it was brief, uneven. And then it stopped. Not with gasps, not with outrage. Just stopped. Like a radio tuned to static, then suddenly cut to dead air. Kash Patel didn't move. He didn't raise his head. He didn't blink. His pen, once tapping rhythmically against the edge of the table, now lay still. His fingers rested beside it, curled slightly, not in tension but in pause, like someone remembering something, not reacting to it. Jasmine, still smiling, glanced to her left. She expected a retort, a defense, a shift in energy. But Patel remained frozen, not out of intimidation, but detachment, as if her words hadn't landed, but had brushed against something too old to respond to, too tired to fight back. Michael Hayes cleared his throat. His hand hovered over his next cue card but didn't pick it up. He looked at Patel, then briefly at Jasmine, then somewhere past them both, as if searching for where the moment had gone wrong. The silence was too measured to be accidental. It wasn't discomfort. It was awareness. A line had been crossed, not loudly but deliberately. Then the camera cut, not to Patel, not to Jasmine, but to the audience. Third row, far right. A man in a gray suit, seated precisely, back straight, hands folded over his lap. He didn't shift, didn't frown, didn't break eye contact with the stage. A small pin gleamed on his lapel. 3 stars, one dulled by time. The camera held on him for barely 1 second, just long enough. No one knew who he was. No name tag, no introduction. But in that moment, the broadcast wasn't about the panel anymore. Something else had entered the room. It hadn't spoken. It hadn't moved. But it was watching. And Jasmine Crockett, still smiling, hadn't noticed. Yet, Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't stammer, didn't retract, didn't pause for approval. She simply moved forward, as if her last line had landed just as she intended. Another pivot, another assertion, another precise slice of commentary. That's how it had always worked. In every courtroom, in every interview, in every panel she'd ever sat on. Momentum was power, and she was a master at riding it. So she kept going. She spoke of equity, of selective narratives, of how some people are handed microphones while others build their voices in silence. She pointed to examples, layered her words with calm wit and conviction. Her rhythm was clean, controlled, her voice steady, her cadence like a practiced cello. She was back in her element. At least that's what it looked like. But the air around her had shifted. It wasn't visible. It wasn't noisy. It was just there, like humidity before a storm. A subtle weight that made the breath feel shorter. Not because of fear, but because of something else creeping in. Something no one wanted to name just yet. Discomfort. Michael Hayes fumbled a cue card. He tried to hide it, but the sound of the cardstock hitting the desk was too crisp. He smiled, cleared his throat, and asked another question. But it was late. The energy had misaligned, like a conductor raising his baton half a beat behind the orchestra. And he knew it. Kash Patel still didn't speak. He didn't need to. His stillness had become louder than Jasmine's eloquence. His silence now formed the negative space around every sentence she crafted. He hadn't lifted his eyes, but he wasn't gone. He was present in a way that felt more deliberate with every passing second. Each breath he took seemed timed, like a man pacing himself not for debate, but for endurance. And the man in the third row had not moved. He remained, hands clasped, shoulders square, gaze locked on Jasmine, not in judgment, not even in confrontation, but in something deeper, something quieter. Watching her like someone who had seen this before, not on television, not in a hearing, but in life. It was only then that Jasmine noticed the rhythm of the room had shifted without her. Her words no longer made the audience nod on cue. The polite laughter had dried up, and the silence that followed her statements was no longer respectful. It was evaluative, cautious, like the room had become a mirror, and people weren't sure they liked what they were starting to see. Jasmine straightened slightly in her chair. She smiled again, faintly, habitually, as if trying to reset the atmosphere. But it didn't take. The air didn't lift. And when she glanced toward the host, she caught something fleeting in his eyes. Doubt. The studio was still well lit. The cameras were still rolling. But something had cracked, quiet and invisible. The audience didn't know it yet. Neither did Jasmine. But the man in the third row did, and he still hadn't blinked. 27 minutes before she stepped onto the stage, Jasmine Crockett stood in the green room with her arms crossed and her mind razor sharp. The producers had offered her water, touch-ups, cue notes. She waved them all off. She didn't need gloss. She needed clarity. A tight crew of aides circled her like satellites, feeding her talking points, statistics, phrases calibrated to resonate with swing state viewers over 50. But Jasmine wasn't listening to numbers. She was listening to the silence behind them, the silence that always told her what was really coming. "You know what to do," her chief aide whispered, leaning in. "Lean into the fire. Let them feel it." She nodded, not just out of agreement, but out of instinct. She had always done that, since her first trial in Dallas, since the day a judge dismissed a black teenager's testimony without even letting him finish, since the town hall in East Texas where a man told her she was too angry to be rational, just for asking why his mayor's budget cut literacy programs in black neighborhoods. She had leaned into the fire so long it felt like oxygen now. But as she stood in that quiet room, adjusting her sleeve cuff with the small silver pin her father gave her the day she passed the bar, a memory stirred, not of strategy, but of stillness. He had told her once, when she was fresh out of law school, still burning with idealism and fury, "Lead with truth, but see who's listening." At the time, she had nodded, certain she understood, but she hadn't. Not really. Back then, she thought truth was a hammer. Now, years later, she knew better. It wasn't a weapon. It was a current. It had to be felt to be followed. But tonight, she wasn't here to follow. She was here to lead, to call things out, to pierce through comfort with clarity. Still, the echo of his words followed her into the hallway, even as the show's theme music swelled behind the studio door. She touched the silver pin once, briefly like a reflex. Not superstition, just grounding. 5 minutes, someone called. The hallway was lined with photos of past debates, frozen smiles, raised hands, fire in the eyes of people who'd long since faded from public memory. Jasmine looked at them, then turned back to the door. Her heels clicked once, twice, and then she stopped, centered herself. She didn't hesitate when the red light blinked on and the door swung open. She stepped into the light not like a guest, but like gravity, a force the room would have to reckon with. And as the crowd applauded her entrance, she didn't hear applause. She heard a question, faint and old, threading its way through her memory. "But who's really listening?" She smiled, not because she had the answer, but because tonight she planned to find out. Kash Patel hadn't moved. While the debate surged beside him and Jasmine Crockett's words carved cleanly through the air like a scalpel, Patel sat like stone, not stiff with tension, not frozen with fear, just still. The kind of stillness that doesn't draw attention, but refuses to release it. The pen once balanced between his fingers now lay flat against the polished desk, untouched. His hands were folded loosely in his lap. His eyes, however, weren't fixed on Jasmine. They hadn't been for some time. They were on the third row, more specifically on the man sitting in it, his father, dressed in a neat gray suit, spine straight, expression unreadable. There was no smile, no frown, just presence. Kash knew that look. He had seen it for decades. It was the same expression his father wore at every parent-teacher conference, every DMV line, every courtroom pew where he sat to support but never speak. A gaze that asked for nothing, offered no defense, but noticed everything. That was how he'd survived in America. Not by demanding space, but by knowing when silence protected more than sound ever could. And so Kash said nothing, not to defend himself, not to counter Jasmine's remark. He didn't even flinch when she made the jab, because this wasn't the first time someone had reduced his place at the table to an aesthetic checkbox. He remembered it from middle school when a teacher asked him, "Do you celebrate Thanksgiving or whatever you people do?" He remembered it from high school when a classmate mimicked his mother's accent in front of him and waited for him to laugh. He didn't. He remembered it from his first week at the Department of Justice when a colleague jokingly called him the diversity dividend. He had smiled politely, then walked to the restroom, splashed water on his face, and stood staring at the mirror wondering how many times he'd need to hear that line before it stopped stinging. Kash didn't hate Jasmine. He didn't even feel angry. Anger, he had learned, was loud, and loudness often got dismissed. What he felt instead was heavier, older, like a book you carry everywhere, even after you stop reading it. He watched his father now, still motionless. The same father who once told him, "People will ask where you're from, not because they care, but because they want to remind you that you're not from here." That sentence had followed Kash into every room he ever entered, including this one. And so, when Jasmine delivered her line, so clever, so composed, so confidently dismissive, he didn't argue. He didn't roll his eyes. He just stopped tapping his pen and looked, not at her, but at the man who had taught him that sometimes the most powerful answer was a silence held long enough to make others squirm. Kash Patel finally moved. Not much, just a shift in his eyes. A brief glance toward the third row, where the man in the gray suit still sat, posture unwavering, shoulders square. But now something was different. His hands, once folded with calm precision, had tightened into fists resting against his knees. Not clenched with rage, there was no tremor, no outward sign of fury, just the slow, unmistakable curl of fingers drawing in. The kind of gesture a man makes when he hears something too familiar, too old, too deeply etched into his story to ignore. Patel saw it and felt the weight in his chest grow denser. That hand, those knuckles, that silence. He had seen them before. On nights when the news called people like his father foreigners, agitators, others. On mornings after hateful graffiti appeared on the family's garage door, and his father would quietly wash it off before anyone else woke up. There was never a speech, just stillness. Just those hands, holding it all. At the table, Jasmine Crockett laughed again. Not meanly, not cruelly, just with the confident chuckle of someone who believes the room is still hers. She leaned back slightly, brushing off a comment from Hayes with a flick of her hand and a grin that said she knew she was winning. And why wouldn't she? The crowd had responded. The segment was flowing. The cameras were still on her. But the sound of her laughter didn't land the same way it had 10 minutes earlier. It didn't ripple. It didn't rise. It fell, soft, subtle, but heavy, like a feather dipped in ink. A moment earlier, that same laugh had made the audience smile. Now it made some shift in their seats. Others looked sideways, not because of what she said, but because of something they couldn't quite name yet. Something in the air, or maybe in the silence. Jasmine noticed it, barely, a flicker in her intuition, the kind that doesn't form words, just sensation. She scanned the front row, then the second, and when her eyes reached the third, she paused. She saw him, the man in the gray suit. Their eyes didn't meet, not fully. She looked just long enough to register him as a presence, not yet a signal. She clocked the suit, the stars on his lapel, the composed posture. Her mind cataloged him as an observer, maybe a retired officer, maybe a conservative critic. She didn't know he was Patel's father. Not yet. She didn't know why the silence around him felt so charged, only that it did. She blinked, smiled again, pressed on. But for the first time, her voice wasn't the only thing being heard. And her laughter didn't echo. It sank. It came disguised in rhythm, wrapped in timing so precise it could have been scripted. Jasmine Crockett tilted her head, eyes gleaming just a little, and let the sentence glide out like a dancer who knows every beat of the music. "You know," she said with that same lilt of amusement, "some folks are brought into the conversation not because they have something to say, but because they're photogenic enough to fit the story the network wants to sell." She smiled, not a wide grin. Just enough. It wasn't direct. It wasn't named, but it didn't need to be. The implication hovered in the space like mist, light enough to be dismissed, heavy enough to linger. Everyone in the studio understood who she meant. The man in the black suit seated next to her, who hadn't spoken, who hadn't fought back, who hadn't earned the audience's laughter, but had earned their attention through silence. Kash Patel didn't move immediately. He didn't flinch. He didn't clear his throat. But the pen he had picked up again, the one that had tapped softly on glass, anchoring his presence through the segment, stopped. He placed it down deliberately, as though drawing a line. Not across the table. Across the room. The audience didn't laugh. Not this time. Instead, there was a hesitation, a long breath between syllables of reality. Somewhere in the back row, someone shifted. A man in the center dropped his crossed arms and sat upright. No sound, just a kind of attentiveness that wasn't there before. The audience wasn't rejecting Jasmine, but they weren't following her anymore either. Michael Hayes felt it. He didn't show it on his face. He was too good for that. But his hand, already poised to lift the next cue card, faltered. The card slipped just enough to glance against the table. He glanced to the left, to the producer's desk behind the studio glass. A crew member raised one hand in question. Another slowly turned a dial on the lighting board. The overhead panels flickered, not visibly but perceptibly, as if even the lights were becoming uncomfortable. The room was still bright, still cool, still perfectly rehearsed, but everything about it now felt warmer, heavier, like someone had just shut the door on a room with too many truths trapped inside. Jasmine didn't notice, or pretended not to. She adjusted her blazer, took a sip of water, smiled again. But this smile didn't land. It hung there, suspended, waiting for an echo that didn't come. And in that brief pause, so small it barely lasted a second, the audience silently, collectively realized that the joke hadn't been one. Patel looked ahead. Hayes glanced sideways. And somewhere, unseen by all but felt by many, the temperature of the room rose by 2 degrees. It happened slowly, so slowly, in fact, that at first no one noticed. The cameras remained fixed on Jasmine and Patel. The light still glared down in perfect symmetry. Michael Hayes shuffled his papers again, attempting to reset the flow. But something in the air had shifted so profoundly, so subtly, that even the silence now felt like sound. And then it happened. From the third row, the man in the gray suit began to move. Not with urgency, not with anger. He didn't sigh. He didn't make a scene. His hands, which had been resting calmly, though now visibly clenched, pressed gently against his knees. His body lifted, slowly, deliberately, like someone standing not to interrupt, but to confirm something already spoken. He didn't look around. He didn't look at Hayes. He didn't even look at Patel. He looked only at Jasmine Crockett. She didn't see him at first. Her focus was still on the table, still on the camera just beyond Hayes's left shoulder. She was preparing her next pivot. That's what she did. Keep the rhythm, control the air, drive the tone. But her rhythm had already started slipping, and she felt it before she understood it, like a dancer whose foot catches half a beat too late. When she finally lifted her eyes and saw him, she didn't know who he was. Not yet. All she saw was a man, older, upright, not smiling, not scowling, just standing, like he was witnessing something that didn't surprise him, only saddened him. It rattled her more than she wanted to admit. She reached for humor, not a joke, just a release valve, something to regain control. Her voice lifted with a quick, confident smirk. Come on, people are too sensitive these days. It dropped into the air like a coin into a dry well. No one laughed, not even the sympathetic corner of the audience who had chuckled at her earlier remarks. Not the production crew, not Hayes, especially not Hayes. He looked at her. No cue card, no prompt, just a momentary pause in his breath, because in that second he too understood. This wasn't just a debate anymore. It wasn't even about what had been said. It was about the moment that now stood in the third row, silent and steady. Jasmine shifted in her seat. Just slightly, but it was the first real fracture. She blinked as if the lights had changed intensity. She glanced at Patel, still quiet, still watching. but not her. He was watching the man who stood, the man who had taught him what it meant to bear weight without showing pain. And Jasmine, for the first time that night, lost her rhythm. She didn't mean to stop. It wasn't planned. It wasn't strategy. It just happened. The words she'd rehearsed in her mind evaporated before they ever touched air. The tight rhythm that had carried her through every sharp line, every verbal jab, every commanding pivot, gone. And in that space, a memory pushed its way in, uninvited but immovable. It wasn't the man in the third row who brought it. It was what he reminded her of. Her father. The memory rose not with grandeur, but with weight. The fluorescent lights were different. The city was different. But the look, the posture, the silence, the refusal to flinch was the same. Years ago, when Jasmine was just beginning law school, she had watched her father, a high school janitor, be mistaken for a trespasser in the very building he worked in. A visiting school board member had questioned his presence, asked for ID, demanded explanation. And her father, standing beside his mop bucket, calmly explained that he cleaned the floors others walked over without thought. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't shrink. He simply stood. Later that evening, she had asked him why he didn't say more, why he didn't push back. He had looked at her with those same eyes, deep, warm, firm, and said, "Because not every battle is won in volume. Sometimes standing still is the loudest thing you can do." Now watching the man in gray, standing with no anger, no rebuttal, just unshakable presence, Jasmine felt that memory collide with the moment. It wasn't just what she saw, it was what it did to her. That subtle, invisible unraveling of certainty. She no longer saw a critic in the third row. She saw a father. Not her own, but someone's. And that made everything different. The laughter she had once carried like armor no longer felt like protection. It felt like noise. Her tongue hesitated at the roof of her mouth, where a retort was ready to land, but never fell. She looked at Patel, and then at the man again, and she stopped. Not dramatically, not with apology, just stopped. Her body softened, barely noticeable. Her voice didn't tremble, but it didn't return either. She sat still, and for the first time that night, she didn't know what to say next. Not because she lacked words, but because she finally realized who was listening. The man in the third row didn't react. He didn't nod. He didn't smile. He just stood as if reminding the room, without permission, that presence can be a form of resistance. And Jasmine, daughter of a man who had once done the same, understood something she hadn't before. Sometimes the moment you stop speaking is the moment you actually begin to hear. For a moment, the room existed in suspension. No movement, no cues, just the weight of a man standing and a woman sitting with her breath caught somewhere between reflex and recognition. Then Kash Patel finally turned his head, slowly, not toward Jasmine, but toward the audience, toward the man still standing in the third row. "That man," he said, voice low but clear, "is my father." It was the first time he had spoken all night. No one moved. Even Hayes, usually quick to redirect or reframe, stayed still, because this didn't feel like part of the show anymore. It felt like something else entirely, a pivot, not in argument, but in air, a change in the gravity of the room. Patel didn't speak like a man defending himself. There was no rise in his tone, no venom, no theatrical pauses, just words, measured, personal, unshakably real. "When I was 10, he said, my father took me to a baseball game. Our first. A man behind us kept asking where we were from. I said, 'Here, New Jersey.' He laughed. My dad didn't. The man leaned in and said, 'No, kid, where are you really from?' He let that line hang. No explanation needed. Everyone in the room had heard some version of it before. Some had asked it. Some had received it. Some had tried to pretend it didn't mean anything. But we smiled through it," Patel continued, "because that's what we were taught. Be grateful. Be quiet. Be better. So no one questions why you're in the room." Jasmine watched him now, not guarded, not defensive, but listening in a way she hadn't earlier. Something about the cadence of his speech, steady, restrained, struck a note that bypassed resistance. He wasn't here to accuse her. He was here to hold something up and ask all of them, to look at it. You said it was a joke, Patel said finally, turning his gaze to her at last. Maybe it was. Maybe it wasn't. But to us, it's an old scar, one you keep covering with new words. His father hadn't sat down. He didn't need to. He wasn't part of the conversation now. He was its proof. And still, Patel didn't cry. He didn't tremble. He just looked at her. Not with bitterness, but with the kind of tired dignity that came from years of carrying what others dismissed. He didn't want an apology. He didn't even want an explanation. He just wanted her and everyone watching to understand that what had felt like a clever line had, for someone else, landed like history. Silence in a studio built for sound isn't absence, it's confrontation. As Kash Patel's final words settled into the room, nothing filled the space behind them. Not applause, not commentary, not even the soft murmur of agreement that usually bubbles up after a panelist makes a heartfelt statement. There was no "thank you for sharing that," no quick pivot. The silence didn't wait for permission to stay. It stayed because no one dared to replace it. Jasmine Crockett, who moments earlier had commanded the rhythm of the conversation like a maestro, now sat completely still. Not frozen, but aware. Her eyes hadn't left Patel since he began speaking, but now they dropped, just slightly, not in shame, not in defeat, but in something quieter, recognition. Somewhere in the second row, a young woman slowly lowered her phone. She had been recording, at first with excitement, maybe even with a touch of tribal allegiance, but her expression had changed. The phone slipped into her lap, screen dimming. She wasn't thinking about posting anymore. 2 seats over, a man in a dark blazer uncrossed his arms. His leg bounced once beneath the chair. He shifted his weight, uncomfortable. Not with Patel, but with himself. Even behind the cameras, the crew had stopped moving. A producer who usually gestured instructions from behind the glass now stood completely still, his hand frozen midair. And at the center of it all, Michael Hayes leaned slightly toward the desk, barely enough for the mic to catch, and whispered, "We're off script." It wasn't for anyone to hear, really. It was a realization said aloud the way a person speaks in church, not to interrupt, but to acknowledge the sanctity of the moment. Because he knew exactly what had just happened. The show had slipped its framing. The dialogue had slipped the reins. The story was no longer being told. It was being revealed. Hayes had done hundreds of live interviews. He'd watched guests argue, cry, shout, storm off. He'd seen scandals break open in real time and reputations collapse in 30-second sound bites. But this felt different. It wasn't explosive, it was implosive. Something had turned inward in the audience, and you could feel it. The room had stopped performing. It had started listening. Jasmine glanced once at Hayes, as if to silently ask what comes next. He didn't answer. Not because he didn't know, but because for the first time he knew better than to try. There were still cameras. There were still lights. There was still a countdown clock running in the corner of the screen. But none of it mattered now. The frame had cracked, and something real had begun to seep in through the break. No one clapped. No one defended her. And that, more than any headline, was how Jasmine knew. The story had changed. She had looked at him before, but never really seen him. When Jasmine first noticed the man in the third row, he was just another face in the crowd, an older gentleman in a suit, perhaps a retired officer, a concerned citizen, a silent observer with a sharp lapel pin. She'd registered him like she did every audience member, by posture, by presence, by potential for disruption or support. But now everything had changed. Now she saw him fully, not just with her eyes, but with something deeper. He was still standing, still silent, but the energy around him had shifted. Not his body, not his expression. Those hadn't changed. It was her perception that had cracked open, and through the fracture, a flood of understanding rushed in. There was no anger on his face, no glare, no theatrical disappointment. But there was weight, the kind that doesn't come from judgment. It comes from experience. He wasn't condemning her, but he was showing her something, the impact of her words reflected back at her without embellishment. Jasmine felt it in the way her stomach tightened. Not out of guilt, but out of recognition. Recognition that she had said something rehearsed, something meant to cut clean and leave no blood. But it had found flesh anyway, old, bruised flesh, and she had not meant to see the wound reopened in someone else's silence. She had thought herself sharp but fair, firm but principled. She had walked into this room armored with causes, convictions, clarity. And yet now, in the face of this man's unspoken history, all that armor felt strangely hollow. She didn't shrink. She didn't apologize. But she softened. Internally, almost imperceptibly. A shift not of posture, but of perception. She saw her own father again, not as a symbol, but as a man. She remembered the way he would straighten his tie every morning, even though his job didn't require one. How he stood quietly behind her during every graduation, never asking to be thanked, just proud to be near. She remembered how he had once told her, "Our dignity is the one thing they can't take, unless we give it away trying to prove we still have it." She looked back at the man in gray, Patel's father, still standing, still silent, still watching. And for the first time, she didn't see a stranger. She saw a mirror, not a reflection of guilt, but of consequence. And in that mirror, her confidence didn't shatter, it shifted. The edge dulled, not because she had lost her power, but because she had finally seen its reach. And what it sometimes bruised along the way. Jasmine looked away, not in shame, but in thought. And when she looked back up, the debate was still waiting, but she was no longer playing to win. She was playing to understand. Jasmine cleared her throat, just once, a simple professional gesture, the kind of reset she'd used 100 times in hearings, interviews, speeches. But this time, it sounded loud. Too loud, like it didn't belong to her voice anymore, but to a person trying to reclaim space that had already been surrendered. She leaned slightly forward, hands still folded, her eyes flicking toward Michael Hayes, searching for some invisible cue to re-enter the current. But the current was gone. Still, she spoke. "I just meant," she began, soft, measured, searching for a tone that could rewind the room. She didn't finish the sentence. The end didn't exist. Not in that moment. It hovered in her mouth like a thread that had already unraveled, the knot too loose to tighten again. There were no interruptions, no audible objections, no shaking heads or furrowed brows. And that, more than outrage, was what made it harder. The silence wasn't protest, it was pause. Long, waiting. Not for clarification, not even for apology, but for honesty. Something uncoded, something real. She could feel the weight of it pressing inward from all sides, like the walls of the studio had become courtroom wood panels. The spotlight above no longer felt like a broadcast tool. It felt like cross-examination. Patel said nothing. He hadn't moved since he sat back down, only moments after his father did. But there was no gloating in him, no satisfaction. He didn't lean back with arms crossed, didn't wear triumph on his face. He was still, thoughtful, but unmoved. His father, now seated again in the third row, had resumed the exact position he held before he rose, hands resting on knees, gaze steady, mouth closed. It was as if nothing had happened, as if he had never stood at all. But everyone in the room knew better. Something had happened, and it was still happening. Jasmine tried again, not with words but with posture. She sat taller, exhaled through her nose, then looked directly at the audience. Not the camera, not the host, people, real people. Eyes that had once sparkled at her sharpness now held something else. Reflection. The kind that didn't challenge her, but also didn't follow her. She realized then that this wasn't recovery. It wasn't about rescuing a moment or regaining control. The moment had moved on, and the room hadn't followed her. It had stayed behind, with the man in the gray suit, with his silence, with the memory that had been named but not dramatized. There were still minutes left in the segment, still questions to answer, but Jasmine Crockett had already lost something she didn't know she'd brought with her, the benefit of momentum. And when no one claps, it's not always because they're against you. Sometimes it's because they're still trying to understand what just happened. Kash Patel didn't raise his voice. He didn't even lift his eyes when he began to speak again. It was the kind of tone you use when you're not talking to win, but because the memory refuses to stay quiet inside you any longer. I was 16, he said quietly. My father took me to a public hearing on immigration policy. It was just a town hall in a crowded high school gym. I remember the smell of old varnish and sweat. There were about 40 people in the room. He was the only Indian there. No one interrupted him. He wasn't invited to speak, Patel continued, but when the microphone was open to the public, he stood up, just like he did today. No notes, no outrage, just stories. He said, I've been a citizen of this country for 18 years. I've paid taxes, I've raised a family, I've picked up trash others left behind because I believed this country could still be beautiful. But still, every month, someone asked me where I'm really from. Patel paused, not because he had lost his place, but to let the echo of that line fall where it needed to. No one clapped then either, he added, but they listened. And afterward, no one asked him another question. Not because they agreed, but because they had nothing left to say. Jasmine listened, still her gaze lowered. Her hands, always precise in gesture, rested now without movement. She wasn't preparing a response. She wasn't rehearsing recovery. She was remembering something, too. A late night in her childhood kitchen. Her father had come home from his second job. Sweat-stained shirt, tired eyes. She had told him about a debate at school, how she had shut down another student with a line so sharp the class had gone silent. She had expected praise. He had simply looked at her, expression unreadable, and said, "Never speak over someone's pain, even if you're right, especially if you are." She hadn't understood it then. She thought he meant not to gloat. She thought he was talking about humility. But now, sitting in the soft collapse of this moment, she felt what he'd really meant, because that was what she had done. She hadn't mocked Patel's pain directly, but she had stepped over it, dismissed it with a smile, covered it with a clever line, wrapped it in humor and handed it to the crowd like a performance. And now here it was, unwrapped, handed back, without accusation, but with truth. Two fathers, one room, neither raising their voice. And for the first time, Jasmine Crockett didn't feel like the most powerful presence in the debate. She felt like the student. She could have said something, a clarification maybe, a redirection, a carefully measured acknowledgement designed to show poise under pressure. Jasmine Crockett had given hundreds of interviews, survived ambush panels, taken fire from political opponents without blinking. She knew how to regain ground, how to reframe, how to flip a moment with words so clean they left no fingerprints. But this time, she didn't reach for language. Because for once, it felt like there were no words that wouldn't make it worse. And so, in the long pause that followed Patel's story, and the longer one that followed her own memory, Jasmine lifted her eyes and let them settle on the third row. Her gaze didn't dart. It didn't flicker. She looked at him fully this time. The man in the gray suit. The man who had stood without needing a microphone. The man who had carried a kind of quiet that didn't accuse, didn't challenge, only endured. Her jaw was set but not clenched. Her breath steady but deeper now. And then, with the smallest motion, so subtle it might have been missed if the entire room hadn't already been holding its breath, she nodded. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't performative. It was barely more than a tilt of her chin, a slow drop of her eyes that lingered just long enough to mean, I saw you, I heard you, and I understand now what I didn't before. That was it. No apology, no statement, just presence, a silent gesture in return for a silent truth. And across the room, Kash Patel's father, still seated, still composed, gave the smallest smile. It wasn't wide, it didn't show teeth, it didn't seek to forgive or absolve. It simply existed, like a shared moment between two people who didn't need to exchange a single word to know what had passed between them. Jasmine's shoulders relaxed, not in relief, but in surrender. Not to the moment, but to its meaning. She was no longer trying to steer the room. She wasn't performing. She wasn't winning. She wasn't even defending. She was simply present, human. And that, in a strange and silent way, felt more powerful than anything she'd said all night. Michael Hayes, still at the desk, watched the exchange. He didn't interrupt. He didn't speak. For once, the host of the show had nothing to add. The cameras caught the nod, the smile, the breath held in the room like glass, fragile, clear, unmoving. And then finally something shifted, not in volume, not in applause, but in gravity, because that moment, not the speech, not the silence, not the standing, was the turning point. The quiet, uncelebrated decision of a woman to lower her defenses and simply nod. It didn't go viral overnight. There were no trending hashtags, no angry comment threads or fast-cut edits soundtracked to cinematic music. It simply aired, quietly, as part of the regular episode archive on the network's website. 43 minutes of footage, unbroken, unpolished. A panel discussion that began like any other and ended like none before it. But what stood out wasn't the debate, not the headlines, not even the confrontation. It was the nod. Just a few seconds of silence. Jasmine Crockett, framed in three-quarter view, glancing at the third row and offering that almost imperceptible tilt of acknowledgement. The camera caught it, not by design, not on cue. It simply happened to be looking in the right place, at the right time, and then it sat there, online, uncelebrated, unanalyzed, unremarkable at first glance, until a high school student in Ohio found it. She wasn't a fan of political shows. She hadn't planned to watch the segment. She'd been assigned to analyze media tone for a civics class. She scrubbed through the clip out of obligation, clicking randomly across the timeline, and paused accidentally on the moment of the nod. Something about the stillness struck her. She rewound, watched again, and then she posted a screen recording to her modest TikTok account with just one caption. He stood, and everything shifted. No hashtags, no music, no filter. That post got 82 likes in the first day. But it wasn't the numbers that mattered. It was what followed. Another student reposted it, then a teacher in Seattle used it in a classroom. Then a youth pastor shared it with his group. Then a local radio host referenced it on air. The original footage began getting shared in smaller, quieter corners of the internet. Not because it was sensational, but because it wasn't. It was real, and it asked nothing of the viewer except presence. People didn't argue about it. They sat with it. And somehow that made the moment louder. The network didn't push it. No headlines were written, but views crept up. Comments, soft and curious, began to appear beneath the video. I've never seen silence feel like a verdict. She didn't have to say sorry. That nod said more. Why do I feel like I missed something important, and now I can't look away? In a time of noise, this wasn't shared for drama. It was shared like a whisper passed from hand to hand. A man stood, a woman nodded. No apology, no humiliation, no destruction, just a shift. And that somehow became the most unforgettable part of the night. It wasn't a movement. No one gave it a name. There were no banners, no marches, no slogans scrawled across protest signs. Just a moment, silent, small, and strangely unforgettable, that began to echo far beyond the studio where it first unfolded. In a high school outside St. Paul, Minnesota, a civics teacher named Mr. Andrews pulled the clip into his lesson plan. He didn't explain it, didn't prep the students. He simply played the footage. Jasmine's smile fading, the man standing, the nod. When it ended, the room was still. A student in the back raised her hand, then dropped it. Mr. Andrews walked to the board and wrote one sentence. What does it mean to be seen but not heard? In North Carolina, a trial attorney named Rebecca Fan was defending a case involving workplace discrimination. During closing arguments, she paused, not to recenter herself, but deliberately. 3 full seconds, long enough to feel uncomfortable, long enough to notice who leaned in. Afterwards, she told her junior associate, "People fill silence with their own truth. If you leave room, they'll listen." She didn't mention the clip. She didn't need to. And in a church tucked between farmland and highway in rural Kansas, a pastor named Elijah Ford rewrote his Sunday sermon after watching the video. He tossed out his notes, walked up to the pulpit, and began with a phrase he hadn't planned. Speak less, see more. Then he told a story, not of a scandal, not of a celebrity collapse, but of a man who stood and a woman who nodded. God speaks loudest, he said, when we finally stop performing and start perceiving. The clip wasn't viral in the traditional sense. It didn't trend, but it settled. In counseling sessions, teachers started letting students sit with difficult questions longer. In family dinners, parents found themselves pausing more before responding to their teenagers. On social media, people began posting the clip not with outrage, but with quiet reverence. I didn't know what I needed to learn until I watched this. I talk too much. Today I'll listen. It wasn't just about Jasmine anymore, or Patel, or even his father. It became a way of asking something deeper. What moments are we rushing past? Who are we speaking over without realizing it? Some reposts called it the stand, others simply called it the nod, but those who felt it didn't need a label. Because for them, it was enough to remember that a man once stood, not to speak, not to shame, but to be seen. And that sometimes what changes people isn't a louder truth. It's a quieter one that stays. She disappeared, not in scandal, not in disgrace, just quietly. No televised apology, no defensive press release, no tweet offering context. Jasmine Crockett simply stepped away. For 4 days, her usual rhythm of cable appearances, committee clips, and viral sound bites came to a halt. Reporters speculated. Commentators filled time with theories. But she said nothing. Not even a repost. And for a woman whose words had always been her sharpest tool, the silence spoke louder than any headline could. Then on the 5th day, she reappeared, without fanfare, on a podcast. It wasn't a major platform, just a mid-size independent show known for long-form conversations, not sound bites. No intro music, no scripted transitions, just 2 voices and an hour of room to breathe. The host, a soft-spoken journalist named Devin Lang, welcomed her with a tone more curious than confrontational. "Jasmine," he said, "a lot's been said in the past few days, but you haven't said much." There was a pause, and then Jasmine leaned into the mic, her voice lower than usual. No cadence, no inflection engineered for broadcast. Just her. Real. Bare. "Some things," she said slowly, "hurt more in silence than they ever would in debate." Lang didn't respond right away. He didn't nod to signal agreement. He didn't fill the air. He let the moment rest, raw and unpolished. And in that space, the meaning landed. She continued, quietly. "When you grow up fighting to be heard, sometimes you forget that listening is its own form of power. I didn't mock him out of cruelty. I mocked him out of rhythm, out of habit. I thought I was on the right side of the argument, so the moment felt safe. But the moment wasn't mine to own." She didn't cry. She didn't justify. But her voice cracked, not from sadness, but from weight. Devin Lang simply nodded. That nod became a symbol all its own. Clipped and shared across platforms the next day with no spin, just a caption, "America's listening." And it was, not to controversy, not to outrage, but to the way a woman who had built her name on confrontation was learning the strength of reflection. No one crowned her a hero. No one cast her as a villain. But in kitchens, classrooms, law firms, barbershops, people replayed that clip and whispered to each other, "Did you hear what she said?" Some who had once dismissed her found themselves reevaluating. Others who had defended her too quickly paused to consider what she had paused to feel. And in a time when most public figures sprinted to reclaim control, Jasmine Crockett chose to sit in the quiet and listen back, not to win, but to understand. He never gave an interview, never sat for a follow-up, never joined a segment titled Voices from the Third Row. Patel's father simply returned home. No press waiting at the airport, no biography hastily assembled. He left the room the same way he'd entered it, without a sound. But someone had taken a photo. It wasn't staged. It wasn't even meant to be shared. It was captured by a young production assistant just before he sat down again, after the moment had cracked open the room, but before the cameras fully understood what they were catching. He stood, face calm, shoulders squared, eyes fixed on Jasmine Crockett, not accusing, not pleading, just there. The photo leaked online within days. No one knew who posted it first. There was no caption, no filter, just the image of a man standing in a room full of seated people, looking at someone not out of anger, but recognition. It wasn't the kind of image that demanded attention. It was the kind you couldn't forget once you'd seen it. At a small independent bookstore in Atlanta, a young clerk printed the photo on standard A4 paper and taped it behind the register. Beneath it, she scrawled in blue pen, "Some truths don't need to be explained." Customers asked if it was a protest photo or a historical one. She only smiled and said, "Just watch the clip. You'll understand." In a high school teacher's lounge in Portland, it was pinned to a corkboard without comment. In a law office in Chicago, it hung in the waiting area beside a quote from Thurgood Marshall. And in a synagogue in Philadelphia, the image was used in a youth program on ethical silence, on how sometimes the loudest justice begins not with confrontation, but with restraint. No one debated what he said, because he hadn't said anything. And that was what made it impossible to argue with. It meant different things to different people. For some, it was a reminder of the power of presence. For others, it was an indictment of how easily pain is dismissed when wrapped in humor. And for many, it was a question, not of who was right, but of how often they'd stayed seated when it mattered to stand. The man in the photo became less of a person and more of a placeholder for something people had been waiting to see. Dignity that didn't demand attention, only space. And across quiet corners of the country, in community centers and classrooms and break rooms and barbershops, someone would pause beside the photo, lean in, and whisper, sometimes aloud, sometimes only in their heart, "I don't know his name, but I know what he did." The room was louder this time. Another congressional hearing, another line of fire. The kind of setting Jasmine Crockett had always thrived in. Rows of cameras, opposing party interruptions, a press gallery ready to pounce on every outburst. It was familiar terrain, but today she carried something unfamiliar with her. Not armor, not a strategy, stillness. A representative across the aisle had launched into a tirade, subtle in tone but barbed in intention. He questioned her record, her priorities, even the relevance of her presence on the committee. It was the kind of political theater that usually begged for a swift, sharp rebuttal, the kind she used to deliver without blinking, slicing through implication with precision, so clean it left no trace but applause. But today, Jasmine did not respond. Not right away. She let 3 seconds pass. 3 long, deliberate seconds. Not as a delay tactic, not to build drama, but to breathe, to feel the weight of the room, to listen, not to the man speaking, but to what his words revealed about who he thought she was. Then she lifted her chin and spoke, calmly. "I hear your concern," she said. No sarcasm, no flair, just clarity. "And I choose to respond with the same respect I wish we all carried into this room." It wasn't weak, it wasn't meek, it was measured. And the room felt it. Even the congressman, eyes trained for weakness, paused, uncertain how to proceed without the familiar rhythm of push and pull. The bait hadn't worked. The echo chamber he counted on hadn't fed him a moment to amplify. There was no performance, only presence, and something shifted. One staffer looked up from their tablet. A stenographer's fingers slowed. Even the air between rows seemed less charged. Because this wasn't Jasmine the firebrand. This was Jasmine the anchor. She wasn't quieter because she had less to say. She was quieter because she'd finally learned the value of waiting until people were truly listening. And in those 3 seconds, she hadn't just paused for composure. She'd taken back control, not just of the room, but of the tone, the expectation, the rhythm of the story others thought they were still writing for her. Later that evening, a journalist covering the hearing tweeted, "Crockett didn't strike back. She waited. She measured. And when she finally answered, the whole room leaned forward. That's not retreat. That's growth." The clip spread. Not because it was explosive, but because it was different. Because now, Jasmine Crockett wasn't just known for how she fought. She was being seen for how she listened, and how she made others listen too. Justice doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just sits still and doesn't flinch. That thought lingers in the air, not from a speech, not from a ruling, but from the aftermath of something quieter, something more enduring. Weeks after the hearing, the clip of Jasmine's 3-second pause continued to circulate, not with scandal, but with resonance. It had no dramatic music, no highlight reel, no overlaid statistics. It was simply a woman who had once led with intensity, now leading with intention. In newsrooms, her transformation became a case study, not of image management, but of evolution. "She's different now," one anchor said. "Not softer, just stiller." But it wasn't a rebrand. It wasn't a calculation. It was a lesson learned in real time, in public, and absorbed with grace. Jasmine Crockett had always been fierce, unapologetically. But now she was something else, too. Aware. Aware that presence without volume could speak just as powerfully. Aware that not every moment demanded dominance. Aware that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is not defend themselves, but sit in discomfort long enough to understand someone else's. She didn't lose her edge. She refined it. And those who watched her, her supporters, her critics, even those who never paid her much mind before, saw something they didn't expect. A politician who didn't just talk about learning, she lived it. In classrooms, teachers still played the clip of the nod. In offices, the photo of Patel's father still hung beside quiet captions. And on screens across the country, Jasmine's silence, and then her clarity, reminded people that leadership isn't always about having the last word. Sometimes it's about choosing not to speak first. She had once been praised for her fire. Now she was being respected for her restraint. And in a world that often mistakes volume for strength, Jasmine Crockett became something rare. A voice who proved that listening is not surrender, but strategy. Not weakness, but wisdom. A closing voiceover might say this: "You don't have to be loud to be heard. You just have to know when to listen." No standing ovation followed, but no one moved from their seat, and that perhaps was the truest applause of all. Sometimes the most unforgettable lessons come not from the things we say, but from the silence that follows what we didn't mean to say. In Jasmine Crockett's journey, we witnessed something rare in public life. Not just a confrontation, but a transformation. Not just a correction, but a reckoning with self. This was never about who won the debate. It was never about a single line or a viral clip. It was about something deeper: the weight of words, the cost of rhythm, and the strength it takes to let the silence speak louder than the applause ever could. One man stood. One woman stopped. And for a moment, the nation remembered what it means to see one another, not through titles, not through judgments, but through the quiet mirror of shared humanity. This story is a dramatized reflection built from fragments of public life, fictionalized moments, and collective memory. Not an exact retelling, but a deeper truth. One that lives not in transcripts, but in the choices we make after the cameras stop. So the next time you're ready to speak, pause. Look around. Someone may be listening not to respond, but to heal. And maybe, just maybe, you don't need to raise your voice to make history. You just need to see who's in the room before you decide what the room should hear. Thank you for staying till the end. Your time, your heart, your presence matters more than you know. If this story spoke to you, speak back. Like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Let's keep this conversation and this fight alive.